My name is Martin Kames. I'm with the Eu Institute, which is an independent research institute for applied ecology. We were founded in 1977, and the German term for energy transition is Energiewende, and that was a term which our institute coined in 1980, so quite a while ago. And in 2011 it became government policy. So that's just the background. I myself working on the ETS since about 2000, and I will present some developments. Oops. Okay, sorry. The background of the ETS, of the European ETS, its development challenges, the actual reform, and also draw some conclusions. One preliminary remark, apologies, I couldn't submit the slides before the session, so you won't find them in your documents, but at the final slide there's my email address. If you would be interested, just drop me an email and I'm happy to share the slides. Progress towards meeting Europe's 2020 and 2030 targets. So basically, which role has the EU ETS, the European Emissions Trading Scheme, in terms of achieving Europe's NDC? And this one is just the NDC. As you can see, the NDC, or the target, the second commitment period KP target for the EU is minus 20%. We are well on track with regard to that. But the NDC for 2030 is minus 40%. And you can see that with projections with existing measures, we are not yet on track within the EU. So there has to be additional measures in order to achieve that. Also some more detailed picture on the emissions per sector. You see historical data and projections, and you can see, as already was explained by the UK representative, most successful emission reduction was in the power sector, in energy use and energy supply, but also the other sectors like agriculture, waste, and also industrial processes really reduced their emissions compared to 1990. Nevertheless, the only problem is the transport sector, where we have a challenge, but I may come back to that later, or perhaps in the discussion. Which role has the EU ETS in this picture? And the first of all is to understand a few key features of the EU ETS. The EU ETS covers 11,000 installations, so a bit more than in Singapore. It mainly covers electricity production, chemical industry, refineries, metal production, petroleum production, refineries, and some other industries. But altogether, it's only 45% of the EU's emission which are covered by the EU ETS. And it also, it started in 2005. Emissions at that time were about 2.4 gigatons, and the target for the ETS in 2030 is minus 43% compared to the 2005 emissions. So the whole thing in terms of targets is a bit difficult because we have different base years, different coverage of gases, different coverage of industries, but these are referring to the coverage, the latest coverage. What happened so far? What did the EU ETS achieve? And you can see the light, or is it green? Yeah, green bars are the supply of allowances, basically the cap was available to the covered installations. And the blue one is then the verified emissions in the respective year. And you can see that we have three different trading periods. So we are currently in the third period. In the first period, the verified emissions were larger than the cap. In the second period, this changed fundamentally, and in the third period, it's again that verified emissions are at least partly larger than the cap or the available allowances or units, I would say. And that, of course, has some impact on the price, which is an indicator for the incentive which are provided by the EU ETS and also the effectiveness of that scheme. And you can see that the price was quite high, like 25 euros and about 15 in 2005 and 2006, but dropped to zero because allowances were not bankable to the second trading period. But it started again with about 20 euro per ton in 2008, sorry, but dropped then considerably and was now until, I would say, mid-2007, around 5 euro per ton. That was mentioned already. And what are the main reasons for that development? The main reason is basically that from 2009 onwards, there was a surplus of allowances, and that so more allowance were available. And this surplus is highlighted by the light blue area behind the bars. And this surplus increased over time. And the reason for this development, this increase of the surplus, was on the one hand the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So the demand, the verified emissions dropped. Then also there was a so-called linking directive which allowed international offset credits to be used, and that increased the volume of the available units. And finally, the contribution of the development of renewables was underestimated when the decision on the cap was done. A bit more details on these three developments, or two of them. So here you can see the energy structure in electricity generation, and that is the largest share of the EU ETS. I think it's even about 80% or I don't recall exactly, but at least above 2/3 of the EU ETS emissions. And as you can see, there are several developments, just three to mention. The coal generation or generation of electricity from coal declined, although I would say just moderate, -35% and -14% for lignite between 2005 and 2016. But the contribution of renewables increased considerably and almost doubled in the same period. So that at least had as one of the reasons for the price development. And then I already mentioned the use of, or the opportunity to use international credits, and there was a limit on that. Over the whole period from 2008 to 2020, there was a budget of roughly 1.5 gigatons, which could be used of international offset credits from JI, Joint Implementation, and CDM in the whole EU ETS. And as you can see in the right bar, this budget is already more or less used, so there aren't any offset budgets left. But the problem was that this amount of 1.5 gigatons came on top of the cap. And so actually it was not just providing more flexibility, but also weakening the cap of the EU ETS, and that was a problem. I come back to that later. So here is a summary of these developments again. You can see with slightly different colors, but the developments in the verified emissions are in light blue, the line which you can see, then the cap of allowances, free allocated allowances. Then you have also the auctions, which started in 2008, first with a small portion, but then in the third period, almost 40% of allowances were auctioned. And then you can clearly see how the light green bars came on top of the cap from the internal allowances. So, what could be done to do that? And there are several measures. One was decided already, I don't know exactly when it was decided, but it was applied in 2014 to 2016, and that can see, or it's called backloading. So basically, I think 900 million tons of allowances were taken out of the system and put aside into reserve to be used at a later stage. That was the first measure, and then there were a few measures which were just decided a few weeks ago in April 2018. And the main elements of the ETS, the current ETS reform include more than half of the allowance will be now auctioned. Although we have a continuation of allocation free of charge for certain sectors. Then there will be a strengthening of the benchmarks for free allocation. So with the result that less allowances will be provided. There will be an update on the criteria for carbon leakage, resulting in fewer sectors being in fewer sectors receiving a free allowance to cover carbon leakage. Maybe I should explain carbon leakage. Basically, it was mentioned in previous presentations, but not at that term. It's that if sectors which are facing international competition, that their competition is to some extent moderated by the free allocation. And then important, and I will provide more details on the start of the so-called market stability reserve and voluntary cancellation by member states. I will explain both. And last but not least, there is a review clause that the whole scheme will be reviewed depending on developments under the Paris Agreement. So as similar to what was explained also by Singapore in the previous presentation. The market stability reserve is actually determined, or the European Commission determines as the surplus. And if the surplus in a certain year is larger than 833 megatons, the auction volume of the next year will be reduced by 24% in the period 2019 to 23, or 12% by 24 in the period 24 to 30. And if the surplus is lower than 803 megatons but larger than 433 megatons, so nothing will be changed. And if it's lower than the threshold of 433 megatons, allowances from the reserve will fed into the market. That is to stabilize the price of allowances. And important, from 2023 onward, the MSR must not be larger than the volume auctioned the year before. And I will explain in the next slide what the effect of that important rule is. You can see here the developments until 2018, and the market stability reserve will be applied from 2019 onwards. You can see that by the green bars to the bottom. And you can see also in 2023 a light green bar, and that is exactly the effect which I described in the second last bullet. Because in 2023 the reserve will be larger than the allowances auctioned to the sectors. These allowances will be cancelled, and that will have an effect will considerably reduce the reserve or the surplus of allowances, and probably have an impact, as we will see in a minute, on carbon prices as well. Not only in 23, but even right now. Then the other was the voluntary cancellation, and to understand the importance of that point, it's important to understand the so-called waterbed effect. So it's nothing on conveniency and sleeping, but it's just to illustrate that if, for example, in the left slide or left part of the slide, one country applies individual measures to reduce emissions, these allowances will not be used in that country, but can be used by other countries. So measures which apply to companies or installations in the covered by the emissions trading system. So in that, so in the EU as a whole, emissions won't be reduced due to the waterbed effect, because what you reduce on one side will be increased on the other side. The whole volume of water will be the same under current conditions. From 2019, these additional measures can be covered or reflected by a withdrawal of allowances by the respective member states of its auctioning share. So, and that will, as you can see, reduce the amount of water in the bed, and so also contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Europe in general. So the caveat of that is that this is strictly restricted, this voluntary cancellation, for decommissioning of power plants. Member states may reduce its auctioning volume by the average of the last 5 years. And it's unclear right now whether this applies to individual blocks or the entire power plants. Yeah. And currently it's not foreseen to compensate for success with other instruments. It's only for decommissioning of power plants. And the last thing is to some extent assess whether these measures really provide a solution to the ETS, to the problems of the ETS. And the first thing is to have a look at the projected cap. As you can see, is what we do have a cap, which resulted, as I said, in minus 43% by 2030. This is the bar at the right end of the graph. And if you look, for example, at the light dotted line, which is kind of a projection of the verified emission of the last like 5 to 10 years. So you can see that it's likely to be lower than the cap as well. And with the member state projections will be above that line, but the verified emissions are to some extent more reliable than the projections, or at least we will have a spread there. And so we might have a problem. And for example, even the German Emissions Trading Authority said in 2006 that the reduction factor should be 2.6 per year. Currently, it's only 2.2. So that also covers or addresses that issue. So we probably do address some short-term problems, but not the structural issues. So does it have an effect? As you can see, I think these slides were already mentioned. We have a drop of the price to the end of 2008, and then the price lingering at between something of 5 to 8 euro in the period 2013 to 2017. But as you can see, it's going back, it's rising again since the end of 2017. And we are now at something like 50 euros. So it also rose in the last few days. So coming to a few conclusions on carbon pricing, and that's perhaps more general, not just the ETS. What really can carbon pricing lever in terms of climate mitigation? And the first one is clean dispatch. That is a term of the power sector and basically refers to the order of the power plants, of the type of power plants, how a company applies them. For example, if there's demand for electricity, tomorrow, then in Germany a company can decide whether they apply a lignite power plants with large CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour, or a gas power plant, or even a renewable power plant. And depending on the carbon price, that will, of course, the decision will be depending on the carbon price. If there's a high price, it's more likely that a low emission source will be used. So with regard to that clean dispatch, you have little alternatives. Carbon pricing is really the best to address that. But we have another goal or level which needs to be addressed, that is strengthen low carbon investments, so like strengthen renewable energies. And there it has only an impact in the long or medium term, but we do have other policies to address that, like subsidies or standards, for example. And then, but not enough with promoting low carbon investments. We also have to decommission or phase out coal that was mentioned in previous presentation as well, because we have only like 30 to 35 years left to phase out, at least in the developed world. And therefore, continuing with coal power is not an option, and at least old coal power plants have to be phased out very quickly. Also there, carbon pricing would require much, much higher prices to do that. But there are other opportunities or other instruments to address that. And then finally, trigger downstream effects so that carbon pricing also influences the prices of consumer products, and that is, as I would say, unknown territory, and we are not really sure whether carbon pricing, or to which extent it really works. And therefore we say that both an ETS or a tax needs to be embedded in a climate policy mix, which includes more than just the carbon pricing policy, which needs to be flanked by clear targets, which need to be updated, which needs to include all kind of instruments like subsidies, but also standards and all that. And so, to conclude, the MSR, the Market Stability Reserve, addresses temporary surplus, but falls short of reducing structural surplus and does not drive decarbonization to the covered sector. The voluntary cancellation provides room for unilateral measures or actions by individual member states. However, the actual cap and linear reduction factor, which is kind of similar, is not compatible with the Paris Agreement. We would require more ambitious targets in the EU ETS. And as I said in the previous slide, the ETS needs to be, which is, as I explained, embedded in a climate policy with an adequate mix to contribute to achieving the EU's NDC. So, some of the figures are in a report which is here shown, the cover page. If you want to have more details, just look this up, and if you want to look into the individual sources, they will be also given in the presentation. Thank you for your attention.